It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I really don't know a whole lot about Rory other than he comes to us from Austin, Texas, and he's dressed well. He's dressed well. So I can't wait to hear your story. Rory, take it away. Thank you for showing up.
Recording in progress.
Well, first, it's easier to like me when you don't know that much about me, so that's a good way to start. My name is Rory McShane. I'm alcoholic. I'm sober since June the 5th of 2010, and thank you all for inviting me to speak here at your group this week. You guys have had some really wonderful speakers. My good buddy Lance H up from Canada. And then my buddy Stephen Rude also from Austin, Texas, spoke to y'all last week. So I figure you guys have had some real spiritual giants come on and give you a talk, and it'd be good for this week. Maybe you guys invited me because we just needed somebody that we could all laugh at together a little bit and give you guys a break from all the serious recovery. I'll be honest with you guys. I'm a little nervous to give this talk. I totally forgot when I agreed that I was going to be traveling for business this week. So I'm sitting in my hotel room, and the hotel here, the internet here at the hotel is no good. So I'm hooked up to the internet on my phone. So I'm just hoping this will work. And if we get to a point where you guys can't hear me, I'll start doing interpretive dance or something, and we'll try and get through the talk. It's interesting. I've had a weird thing happen to me over the last couple of months. I've started to be asked to speak a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous. When I get home to Austin, Texas, Friday, I'm speaking at our citywide group Saturday. I'm speaking at a Zoom meeting in India Sunday. I've been speaking at least once a week for the last probably 3-4 months, and I went to my sponsor and I told him, I've been getting asked to speak a lot recently. Maybe I'm getting more spiritual. And my sponsor kind of has this look he gives, and he goes, "No, I think AA is getting too crowded. So they're probably having you come around to speak to see if they can drown it out a little or thin it out a little bit." I'm very fortunate to have a sponsor who is in no way impressed with me, as he often reminds me. My sponsor is Bob D. from Las Vegas, Nevada. I have a home group, the Primary Purpose Group of Austin, Texas. I have a service commitment, and I sponsor a lot of men in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I don't do any of that because I'm trying to win an AA toaster. I do that because I am a guy who 14 years sober, without the intervention of this program, without the direct infusion of the grace of God, will drink or take my own life again. Will drink again or take my own life at some point. What this program has given me is it has arrested the cycle of alcoholism in my life. It hasn't cured me of alcoholism. It has cured me from a hopeless state. It has recovered me from a hopeless state of mind and body, but it has arrested the cycle of alcoholism. But if I stop engaging in the actions of this program, then it won't be long before all of the things that the book tells me will happen. I will become restless, irritable, and discontent. All the symptoms on page 52 will come true. I'll become prey to misery and depression. I'll have trouble in my personal relationships. I'll become full of fear. Today we call that anxiety. And eventually the mental obsession will take over, and I'll drink again. And because I suffer from the physical allergy, I'll drink until I can't stop. Can everybody hear me okay? And when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't understand the first step, right? I understood the first part of the first step. I understood that once I started drinking, I couldn't stop. I understood that there were plenty of days where I said I was going to meet my buddies. I got sober at 18 years old, and there was one bar that would let me drink because I knew the guy who owned it, and and I really didn't want to screw up at the bar. It's called CC's Tavern in Exington, and I really didn't screw up at the. I wasn't going to be able to drink in bars, right? And I mean, I remember going in there saying, I got to keep myself under control. I cannot get thrown out of this place. and and just getting beyond loaded and starting a fight with the guy in the band and just doing all kinds of nonsense and getting thrown out of there, right? And I could repeat that story 100 times that I said I'm going to go to the party or go to the bar or whatever, and I'm going to just have a few. I'm not going to go crazy tonight. The police aren't getting called tonight. I'm going to be home by midnight. I got to work in the morning, or whatever the case may be. And then always blowing past that mark again and again and again. And it never once happened as taking a couple drinks and saying, well, I think I'm feeling the effects of a physical allergy. It happened as I say I'm going to have 3, but then right when I get to 2, I realize that 3 was a really stupid number, and today's a really bad day for 3. Right? And I think that I'm just changing my mind, and I didn't realize that wasn't the case. Right? I predominantly drank in and later got sober in outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and I like to go places when I drink, right? I'm a blackout drinker predominantly, and the East Coast, all the states are very small, right? Like you could start drinking and go into a blackout in Maryland and wake up in Virginia or Pennsylvania or Washington, D.C. or Delaware. And I live down in Texas now. It's a huge state. And the stories just aren't that cool because you can go into a blackout and drive all night. You just wake up in a different part of Texas. So I say all that to say when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I understood the first part of the first step. I understood that when I started and I honestly wanted to, I could not stop. But what I didn't understand was the second part of the first step. I didn't understand on page 20 and 21 of our book, it talks about the difference between the hard drinker and the real alcoholic. I didn't understand. I used to run with this guy named Dan Sink. And if the two of us had gone to see an addiction counselor kind of person together, and they'd given us, that 20-question test they give you, right? And we drank about as much as each other, and we used as many outside issues as each other, and we committed petty little crimes while we were drinking together and thought we were little gangsters together, and both ended up back at our mom's houses together, and which is the last stop on the road for any good gangster. That test would have shown that Dan and I were both alcoholic, right? But the difference between me and Dan was he had come to me one day and he had said he had met this wonderful girl, Megan, and he was in love with her. And her family, I guess, had some kind of connections up in New Jersey where they were from. And they were going to get him into this fireman school, EMT kind of school. And if you went to the fireman school, you couldn't drink or use outside issues. And he said, Rory, I love this girl and I want to marry her and I want to get my life on track. And I have sufficient reason. I'm going to stop all this stuff. And he did the craziest thing that just baffled me. He was able to stop. And that never made sense to me because I was the guy who swore to God I was going to stop, and I was never able to pull it off. When I was 17 years old, I'd gotten this girl pregnant, and she was a wonderful young lady, very sweet, very nice. And she'd come to me and told me she was pregnant. And I said, Teresa, I'm going to, and I had a good father growing up. And I said, Teresa, I want to be a good father, and I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to straighten up my act. I'm going to get sober. I'm going to stop screwing around. And I promise you. And I promised, and her father was a supervisor in a construction company. And he said, Rory, if you can straighten up your act, I'll get you a job on the construction crew. And I went to my father and I said, Dad, I swear to God, if you'll let me come and move back in the house, I swear to God that I will not drink anymore. And I mean it. And you could have hooked me up to a lie detector test and I would have passed the lie detector test. And 6 weeks later, I come to in a motel bathroom in Hagerstown, Maryland. Because, see, what I don't know is that I might have well as promised that man that I was going to sprout wings and fly around the room and come back and land. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a program for people who can make up their mind to quit drinking and pull it off. Alcoholics Anonymous is a program for people who swear to God we're going to stop drinking it and swear to the girlfriend and the wife and the husband and the children and the boss that we're going to stop drinking. And for whatever reason, we can never seem to pull it off. And that was me. I went through my first rehab at 16 years old, and I did the most important thing you can do in your first rehab. I got a rehab girlfriend, and a lot of people like to knock rehab girlfriends, but how do you know it doesn't work if you haven't tried it once? That's all I'm going to say. So when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I understood that I couldn't stop, that every time I said I was going to stop drinking, that it never worked, right? And I hated it here. I hated it in Alcoholics Anonymous. My first month. I mean, my first month sober, I was, I'm living at mom's house, and I think she kicked me out, and then I'm staying at dad's house, and he's letting me sleep on the couch if I'll go to meetings, and and I'm going to 3 meetings a day, and I'm smoking 5 packs of cigarettes a day, and everyone in AA, especially when you're new, they're always so flippin' grateful for flippin' everything, right? And, you're just trying not to shake the coffee out of your hand and maybe catch a glimpse of the new girl. And all these people are like, I saw a rainbow on the way to the AA meeting, so I knew God wanted me in AA. And you're just like sitting there wanting to punch him in the parking lot. And, and see, I didn't understand. What I didn't understand, and I don't know if they weren't saying it or I wasn't hearing it, and I would guess it's I wasn't hearing it. What I heard them saying was they used to drink like I drank, and then they came to Alcoholics Anonymous and they stopped drinking and their life got better. Well, I'd come to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was going to AA, and my life was just getting more miserable and more miserable. Because, see, the problem with a guy like me is when I stop drinking, it feels like I'm taking and holding my breath. And anybody can hold their breath for 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes. But once you get to holding your breath to 3-4 minutes, it's extremely painful. I could not drink for 2 days or 3 days or a week or 2 weeks. But once you get me past that, it starts to become extremely painful. Clancy I used to put it perfectly. He said, it's like if someone breaks into my house in the middle of the night and installs a spring in my gut, and that spring just gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And I'll tell you what happened, and I believe this was an act of divine providence. I was standing outside the Saturday night young people's meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, and this guy comes up to me. His name was Kelson B. He's passed now. His name was Kelson Blodgett. And he said, "What are you doing, man?" And I said, "I'm just trying not to drink and go to meetings. I'm trying not to drink and go to meetings." And it was that story was later retold to me by other people who were there, and apparently, and I didn't remember this, but I was at the meeting in one of those what do you call them, cut off A-frame. They used to call them wife beater T-shirts. I'm sure they have a more politically correct name for them now. And my arms out, tattoos, all this, and I was not looking like the most approachable fellow, right? And he says, what are you doing, man? I said, I'm just trying not to drink and go to meetings. I'm trying not to drink and go to meetings. And Kelson had, I think, the 2 most important qualities that he could have. He was, first, properly armed with the facts about himself. And secondly, he was a little bit of an asshole. And so he didn't just say to me, "Oh, keep coming back, Rory, everything will be okay." He didn't say, "Well, double up on those meetings and you'll be fine." He said, he took a step back, takes a drag off his cigarette, looks at me and says, "You're probably going to die inside the meeting." Because I'm like, who the heck are you to talk to me like that? But he said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." And he took me down to the diner, and we opened up the book to the doctor's opinion on XXVIII. And we went to page 52, and he explained to me the cycle of alcoholism. He explained to me that a hard drinker's problem is alcohol, but an alcoholic's problem is sobriety. And that if I didn't engage in these steps, that the misery, the depression, the trouble making a living, the trouble in personal relationships, the constant self-centered fear, the restlessness, the irritability was going to overtake me. And eventually I would, against my own will, drink again. And he did. And that made sense to me because all of a sudden I not only did I understand that I drank like these guys drank, but I also felt like they felt like I felt when I wasn't drinking. And that level of identification, I think, for me was probably more powerful even than that we drank like each other. And it tells us in our book, we pull the newcomer with a vision, right? And that's the other thing these guys did for me, right? In working with others, there's a I don't think of what I'm going to say before I speak. I kind of just talk to God a little bit and maybe take a drag of a cigarette and say, "Help me." So, if I just veer wildly off course and y'all are having trouble following me, talk to the manufacturer. Okay. I've got, I don't take any responsibility for what comes out of my mouth here. There's a part in our book on page, what is it on here? Page 97, my buddy Gary likes to call these the 12-step promises. And on page 97, it says, it may mean loss of many nights' sleep and great interference to your pleasures or your business. Okay, I'm going to have some pleasures and a business. It may mean sharing your home, your money in your home. Oh, I'm going to have money and a home. Okay, that's not too bad. Your telephone may jangle at all hours of the night. I'm going to have a telephone. A drunk may smash the furniture in your home or burn your mattress. I'm going to have furniture, a home, and a mattress. That's not too bad, right? Because I've been in times I haven't had any of those. And what these guys did is they understood that their responsibility to the newcomer was far more than to just say, okay, buddy, we hope to see you at the meeting next Friday, right? They took me out. They took me out to Rip's restaurant in Bowie, Maryland, and they bought me a cheeseburger when I didn't have any money. And that weekend, all the men in the home group were going to the beach, which was about 2 hours away, and they were going to go to meetings and read the big book and throw the football on the beach and swim in the ocean. And they said I was going to go with them, and I didn't have any money for going any kind of beach or any kind of stuff like this. But they said, no, you're coming with us, and we'll figure it out. You'll sleep on the couch. We'll make it work. Meet us at the parking lot tomorrow at this time. And then they said, we're going, and they had a current. They had a current that was rushing in one direction, and they pulled me into the current with them. And I believe that if it hadn't been for those guys, I don't think I'd be sober here today. They were fired up about carrying the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were fired up about all three of our legacies. Recovery is an important legacy, but they were fired up about unity, and they were fired up about service. And we used to drive all over the East Coast, picking up guys and taking them to meetings and going to different meetings. And I think that's so incredibly important. And I think it was because I was in that current of recovery that when they said, okay, now you're going to write your 4th step. And I was only about probably 6 weeks sober when I'd written my first 4th step to do my first 5th step. There was no pushback. There was no, well, don't you think I should wait a little bit longer? And I don't feel ready yet. That was what these guys were doing. And they seemed to be happy. I remember the night I met those guys, and I don't remember anything that they said other than that one brief conversation. I don't remember their shares in the meeting or anything like that, but I remember that they were happy and they were sober. And here was the most important thing. They were talking about what was happening in their lives today. They weren't talking about 2 years, 5 years, 7 years ago, I used to drink all this and I used to get arrested and I used to do outside issues. They were talking about starting businesses and getting married and having wives and having children. And I could see that this God thing that you guys were talking about had been somewhere in their lives. It wasn't that I didn't believe in God when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, but I really didn't want to pray. I was really worried God would find out where I was, and that wasn't going to be good for me if that happened, right? I travel all the time. I'm on the road about, 120 days a year. A lot of it's business and occasionally for AA. When you're standing on the ground and you see an airplane overhead, the airplane looks like it's moving very slow because you have no point of reference, right? You have no point of reference to see how fast the airplane is moving. But when you're in the sky and it's kind of rare to see this, but I fly enough that I see it somewhat regularly. When you're in the sky flying in an airplane, you see another plane go by you, you can see how incredibly fast the other plane is moving. But here's the interesting thing. The trail of white jet smoke that an airplane leaves, you don't see that when you're in the sky. But when you're on the ground and you look up and you see the plane has gone by, you see the trail of white jet smoke behind it, even though the plane now might be dozens or even hundreds of miles away. And I think that God is very much the same way. I cannot see where God is, but I can see where he's been. And I could see that God had been in these men's lives, and he told me that I would have to have that same experience. So I'm 6 weeks sober, and I do this first 4th step, and I go over to my sponsor's house after the Friday night meeting to do the 5th step. And if you read in our book on page 14, Bill talks about his spiritual experience at Towns Hospital. But one page before that, he talks about working the steps of the Oxford movement, the 6 tenets of the Oxford movement. So I sit in this guy's garage until 1 o'clock in the morning, and maybe even later than that, and doing everything it tells me to do on page 75. And I leave his garage, and I had a spiritual experience leaving his garage. It was the late summer, and it was thunderstorming, but it hadn't started raining yet. and I could breathe. I felt like I could breathe the free air again. And for the first time since I could remember, I didn't have the desire to drink. A spiritual experience, as I understand it, is a result of spiritual action, and only a result of spiritual action. And it wasn't 2 weeks later, but I was out making amends. These guys weren't about, let's wait till you get a year, let's work a step a month, any of that stuff. 2 weeks later, I'm out making amends, and the first amends I made was to this hardware store that I'd worked at, Clement Hardware on Ritchie Highway in Maryland, and I'd stolen some stuff from them and I'd sold it and all this while I was working for them. And I remember sitting in the car outside the hardware store, and I'm not kidding you guys, it's embarrassing to admit, but I've got tears in my eyes in the parking lot of the hardware store. And I'm on the phone with my sponsor, and I'm like, what if they call the police on me, man, right? And I've noticed this now sponsoring a lot of guys. Do you ever notice that the day before we get sober, we're the biggest, baddest gangster you'd ever want to meet? We're not afraid of the law. We're not afraid of anything. But the minute we get sober, me go to jail? I couldn't possibly, right? So I'm on the phone with my sponsor, and I'm like, I've got tears in my eyes. I'm so scared to make this amends. But he did what I believe the most important thing a sponsor can do. He gave me a hopeless case of the first step. Because all he had to say to me was, well, do you want to make the amends, or do you want to go drink vodka? And of course, if I was being honest, I would have said, well, I want to drink vodka, right? But what he had explained to me was that if I drank again, I wasn't going to be able to stop. And if I stopped, I wasn't going to be able to stay stopped. And that if I didn't make this amends, I would end up drinking again. I think it's on page 23. It says the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind, not in his body. The fact that I have a physical allergy to alcohol is a big problem. The fact that I have a body that don't drink regular is a big problem. But if I had a physical allergy to peanut butter, the answer would be really simple, right? What do people who are allergic to peanut butter do? They just stay away from peanut butter. They don't go to Peanut Butter Anonymous. They don't get a peanut butter sponsor, and they don't work the peanut butter steps, right? And if my only problem was what happened when I drank alcohol, the answer would be really simple. Don't drink alcohol. And but they'd explained to me that I was in this cycle, and that unless it was arrested by spiritual intervention, I'd drink again. So I go into the hardware store, and it was a small store, and I asked for the owner, and he comes out of the back, and I'm so nervous. I was talking 1,000 miles an hour, probably like I am today. And I'm like, I used to work for you from this day to this day, and I stole this much stuff, and here's some money, right? And, and he's so confused. He takes the money and he looks at it and he's like, do you want a receipt, or what do you, and I was just so scared. I just got the heck out of there and no, thank you, sir. And got the heck out of there and got in my truck before he could wise up and change his mind. And, and then the most interesting thing started to happen. In my early sobriety, I remember my sponsor telling me there were some guys living at the Helping Up mission in Baltimore, and that I was going to start picking these guys up and bringing them to meetings, and I was going to sponsor these guys. And I thought, wow, they must really hate these guys. They must want these new guys to die if they're sending me up there to sponsor them. But say yes. And all of a sudden I start driving all over Maryland, picking up guys, 2 hours away from the meeting, picking up guys 45 minutes away from the meeting, bringing them to the meeting, bringing them back, and buying them a cheeseburger afterwards. And what I've found in his last talk, Dr. Bob said our program is quite simply love and service. And I've been reading Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers recently. And what's really interesting is that in the first 4 years of our program, there was not an agreed upon method of recovery, right? In the Cleveland area, they were really big on the four absolute. I'm sorry, in the Akron area, they were really big on the four absolutes, and that was kind of their method of recovery. And then in New York with Bill and the Calgary Mission, they were big on the Oxford movement. And then in Cleveland, they were reading the Methodist Weekly Bulletin. They would apply the principles of the Methodist Weekly Bulletin in their lives. But there was not this codified process of spiritual awakening like there is today. That wasn't put down on paper until 1939. From 1935 to 1939, they were kind of just taking their best stab at it. But what constantly, when Dr. Bob in his last talk said our program is quite simply love and service. But what was constantly a a first and foremost for our early members was that the greatest key to sobriety is shifting our focus from ourselves to the next alcoholic. There was he's referred to as Ernie G, who was a young man when he came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and they didn't know at that time what worked and what didn't work. And he came in the Akron area, and they told Ernie, they said, look, Ernie, you're a young guy and you need to focus on a family and a career and stuff like that. You come to the meetings at T. Henry's house, but you don't need to be out here running around the gutters with us every night scooping up drunks. You need to come to the meetings and then go home and focus on your family. And what was really interesting is that Ernie was never able to stay sober. And he actually married Dr. Bob's daughter and drank successively for the rest of his life. And so much so that Dr. Bob's daughter had for many years a big hatred of Alcoholics Anonymous, because this program that her father had co-founded couldn't seemingly get her husband sober, right? And what these guys explained to me is that this was a process of shifting my focus from self-centered to other-centeredness. And I'll say this, man, I have bought thousands and thousands of cheeseburgers trying to pay back those guys who sat with me at Rip's Restaurant in Bowie, Maryland. And I told that story one time at a conference in Portland, Oregon, and a guy hollered out in the back, they could have bought you a salad once or twice. And that guy, I'm just saying, he's still a little bit there on the resentment list. That's all I'm saying. And I'll tell you what happened though, man. I know people who this is their story, and I love them and they're friends of mine. I know some people who they come into Alcoholics Anonymous and they get down on their knees and they do their first third step prayer, and they get up and they just live by the tenets of this program every day from here to kingdom come. And that hasn't been my story. And if that is your story, I love you. But if you're kind of a D student in AA, I'm here to say D students can still stay sober, even if it isn't always pretty sometimes. When I was 2 years sober, I was stealing data from this company that I was working for. What happened was a senior guy I was a low level guy, and a low level associate, and a senior partner at the company had gotten fired, and he calls me up and he says, hey, I've got the passwords to the database. Let's I'll give you the passwords, steal the data, sell it to the competitor. I'd like to tell you that there was one thought in my mind about how this was really unspiritual. I thought God was trying to make me rich in a hurry. I mean, I was like, this is a great plan we got going here. And, by the time I was 4 years sober, I knew that internal condition had rebuilt. The spring in my gut was tight again, right? The misery and the depression, that low level, constant depression was on me again. And if I didn't make amends for these things, that I was inevitably going to drink again. And I remember I went to their office in Southern Indianapolis, and I was unemployed at the time. I had $500. I knew I wasn't gonna be able to pay my rent at the end of the month. I'm talking to myself in the car for like a good hour probably about trying to convince myself to go make this amends. Have you ever noticed, by the way, the voice in your head that doesn't want you to make the amends always seems far more reasonable than the voice that wants you to make the amends, right? And finally, I kind of said to myself, like, well, federal prison is somewhere to live, so I guess I will go make the amends, right? So I go into the office and I ask for the owner of the company, and again, a relatively small company, so they're able to see me shortly. And I explained to them, I worked in your Washington, D.C. office, from this day to this day, and I stole, this data. I sold it to your competitors. I have no idea what it's worth. I'm sure it's worth a lot. I have $500 with me right now that I'm going to give to you, and I will pay you as long as you tell me. I'll pay you as long as you tell me to pay you. And if that's not enough for you and you want to press charges, I'll plead guilty. And they, unfortunately, that wasn't one of those amends where they said, just stay sober, Rory. We're glad you're in AA, right? They said, we want you to put this all down on paper, sign it, and we're going to give it to our lawyer, and our lawyer is going to get to decide what to do. And that is a butthole puckering moment. Let me tell you that. We're going to give this to our lawyer. That's a shriek moment right there. But I did, and I handed it over to them, and And every day for probably the next 2 or 3 months, I was confident that, the hammer was going to drop, the shoe was going to come down, and it never did. And that was, gosh, almost 10 years ago now. And I'll tell you something really interesting. I'm still in the same industry that I was then. And I'll tell you something really interesting that happened. About a year ago, I was driving from West Texas back to Austin. It's a long drive. And the owner of that company called me. I hadn't talked to him in a long time. And I picked up the phone and I said, "Hey, Kurt," and we have a little small talk and stuff like that. And I said, "Well, what are you calling for, bud?" And he said, "Well, I was just thinking, Rory, what if I started my own company some years ago." And he said, "I was just thinking, what if our company were to buy your company out and you were to come be a senior vice president at my company, right?" And see, what I don't understand is in the third step contract, it says at the top of page 63, "If I will keep close to God and I will perform his work well, he will provide what I need." And I don't understand that that in a 10-year time span, God is arranging the universe for me, that God is arranging my life if only I will live in fulfillment of that contract and in front of God's will. And moments like that, they're like little postcards that just remind me, that say, "I've got your back, Rory. Love God." I've been shown a grace here in Alcoholics Anonymous that I'm unworthy of. When I was 6 years sober, I was deeply involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was chair of the Young People's Committee in Las Vegas. I was GSR. I was intergroup. I was sponsoring half the Salvation Army. But it's almost a shame to say this, but I never wall. And don't get me wrong, there's some spiritual stuff that can happen as a result of that, but not the level that our founders, I think, intended, and why they put it down in the book. And I remember I was sitting in a hotel room with Charlie Parker, who sponsored me up until he passed a little over a year ago, and his wife Katie. We're down in Jacksonville, Florida, and my life's a mess, right? And it's, I'm deep in the middle of AA, but I'm making good money at that time. I don't think I was making six figures, but I was making, a respectable amount of money, but my bank account's overdrawn every month and every credit card is maxed out. And I've got yet another girl pregnant. And for those of you who've heard me speak a couple of times, that's kind of a repeating theme in my story. It's a little underlined, like a subplot there. And I don't understand why my life is falling apart. And Katie starts asking me a series of questions. She says, "Rory, when's the last time you wrote out an 11th step review?" And I kind of stutter for a minute. She says, "Well, Rory, how many questions are there in the 11th step?" And I like quickly think of the 11th step on the wall. And I'm like, "Well, there's no questions in the 11th step." And she's like, "That's wrong." And I'm like, "Okay, there's 12 questions in the 11th step, because normally 12 is the right answer to anything around here, right? If it's a number." And she's like, "No, Rory, that's also wrong. There's 10 questions in the 11th step, right?" And she says, "Well, what are the 4 instructions in the 10th step?" And I'm like, "Okay, continue to take inventory, and when we're wrong, promptly admit it." I've never been a big fan of that, by the way. I'm looking for the part where it says, "When we're right, we promptly admit it." That's a program that I can really get down with. And I had no idea what the instructions in the 10th step were. And going through the steps with Charlie and in that group, it changed. Page 60 to 63 took on a new meaning for me, and it changed the way I look at sobriety. And in 60 to 63, what happens is we stop talking about the problem as alcohol, and we start talking about the problem as selfishness and self-centeredness. And I believe that our big book is divinely inspired, because they wrote the big book when they had about 4 years sober. And had you come to me at 4 years sober and you said, "Rory, the root of your problem is selfishness and self-centeredness," I would have said, "No, it's not. The root of my problem was alcohol and outside issues. Now the root of my problem is the girl, the boss, the kids, whatever it might be," right? And the problem is because when I hear selfish and self-centered, I think arrogant and conceited. I think about loud guys who talk too much and wear too much gold jewelry. And I don't know if you can see, but I'm wearing a lot of gold jewelry and I talk too much, right? But what we have to do is we have to look one line above that in the book where it says, whatever our protestations are not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, and our self-pity. The reality is that my life is consumed by thought of self. Right? From the moment I wake up in the morning, I don't know if anyone else has this, but I heard a speaker put it this way one time, and it was so beautiful. I have that voice in my head that says, you're too fat. She's definitely going to leave you. You're probably going to go broke. No one really likes you. Good morning, Rory. Right? And if I look at those statements, what all those are is it's thoughts of self. And this entire process is a process to move one of the questions in the 11-step nightly review is, was I thinking of myself most of the time, or was I thinking of how I can help others? The way that I dig this channel and I create this connection with God and I create the conscious unity with God is I turn my actions to others. Because what I come to realize is in working 60 to 63 is that the calamity in my life is a result of a life focused on self. And my experience has been is that when I'm willing to truly apply these principles in my life, that when I'm willing to truly try to change my focus from a life of self to a life of service, that I get to have a life beyond my wildest dreams. And the craziest thing is, even all these years later, I never think that's the answer. Right? When I'm going through something and I call Bob, my sponsor, up and I talk to him about it, and what he often asks me is, how am I living my side of the third step contract? And that never seems like the answer. It never seems like the answer to go meet with one more new guy at the halfway house, to hear one more fifth step, to give one more AA talk. But inevitably what I find is that it is only, I don't know if anyone else has had this experience. There are times when I know that the answer is God, right? When I be it self-pity, be it a strong resentment, or be it self-centered fear, I know that the answer is God. But I'm so locked up, the resentment is so strong, I can't get to God. You ever try and meditate when you got a really good resentment? And you're like, I hope a bomb drops on this OB, right? And in those moments, the only thing that I have experienced that can remove the overwhelming consciousness of self from me is the intensive work with another alcoholic. And I've had times where I'll be in the truck and I'll be on the way to fight with my girlfriend, or I'm pissed off about a business deal or whatever, and I'll think to myself, as soon as I call these sponsees back, I'm going to let them have it. But then through the process of shifting my focus from myself to others, and the process, and 45 minutes later, I get off the phone with 4 or 5 guys I sponsor, and all of a sudden I don't even remember what it was I was that mad about. See, I believe in Alcoholics Anonymous, we're not healing anything. The same way a doctor doesn't heal, right? Bob Bazans puts it really well. A doctor doesn't heal. A doctor creates an antiseptic environment and God heals. A doctor creates an environment in which healing can take place and God heals. A farmer doesn't grow anything. A farmer tills the soil and creates a nutrient-rich environment in which growth can take place. And that's what we're doing here in Alcoholics Anonymous. What prevents growth from taking place is this overwhelming suffocation of focus on myself. And what I do here in Alcoholics Anonymous is I remove the suffocation and the focus on myself, and growth can take place, and we can heal, and we can grow in the image and the likeness of our Creator. The problem with that for a guy like me is it takes an intense level of surrender to do that. I had a situation, I guess about a year ago now, where my business was in real trouble. We had, 8 or 9 days. I have 22 employees. We had 8 or 9 days of cash left in the bank. If we didn't come up with some cash really, really quickly, people were going to lose their jobs, and we were going to be bankrupt. And it had come to my attention that we'd made a huge error on a contract, and it wasn't malicious. It was through lack of oversight. Nobody had double checked people's work, and it was a $36,000 contract, and it had come to my attention after the contract was done, after we'd been paid for it, that we screwed this up. And I called my sponsor, and I knew I had to do something. I'm talking to him about it, and I'm trying to wrangle a way that I can make amends but keep their money, right? And that is let me just say, that's a strategic error. If you want to hold on to the money in your bank account, you got to not get honest with your sponsor, right? That's a key first piece. So I tell him what's happened, and he said, you got to pay the whole thing back right away. And I said, well, I can't pay it back right away. I got 9 days of cash in the bank. But we are in the business of trusting infinite God rather than our finite selves. So I literally wrote out the email, and I called my sponsor and I read it to him, and I explained to the customer our error. I explained to them that I'd be sending back all the money right away. And he said, okay, good. And I sent off the email, and they responded, and they didn't just say, just keep the money, Rory, we're glad you're in AA either. They said, great, here's our wiring information. Send it on, man. And I did, and I sent them the money, the very next day. And then the strangest thing happened. They responded, and they said, we really appreciate you doing that. No one's ever done that before. We've got some more contracts coming up, and we'd like you to submit bids for them. And my business is today in a better spot than it's been in, well, at least the last probably 2 or 3 years. And again, it's another one of those little love letters that's from God that says, I've got your back, Rory. Love God. I love Alcoholics Anonymous so much. Whenever I speak, whether it's a Zoom meeting or at a podium, I do so in a coat and tie, and not because I think anyone at the Grace Group cares that I'm in a coat and tie, and I don't think God cares that I'm in a coat and tie. I do it to remind myself that I owe Alcoholics Anonymous absolutely everything that I have in my life, and I owe Alcoholics Anonymous the absolute largest amount of respect and reverence that I can bring to it. So I appear before you in a coat and tie. But we are on a Zoom meeting, so pants are optional, right? I think. And and the truth is Alcoholics Anonymous is the last house on the block. It's the only place to go for a guy like me. Because as much as I've done this for some time, and as much as I know the book, the ego will constantly rebuild itself. And what the ego will tell me is that, okay, Rory, God handled all those other situations, but you have to handle this one. You can't go to the meeting tonight. You got to finish that business deal. You can't call that sponsee back. You've got to do this. And it will walk me little by slowly away from unity. It will walk me little by slowly away from our first tradition. And eventually, without this program, I'll drink again or I'll take my own life. When Bill Wilson was writing the 12 Traditions, he had moved from Brooklyn up to Stepping Stones, right? Well, Lois had come to him and said, please, let's move. I want to get away from everything. I want to have some time with just us. And Lois and Bill thought, well, I can't deny her that. She spent her entire life taking care of me, first when I was drunk and now that I'm building Alcoholics Anonymous. And they move away from New York up to Stepping Stones, where he writes the 12 and 12. And while he was writing the 12 and 12, he was so depressed. There are letters in our archives. Our trustees were sending themselves back and forth to each other letters that he was so depressed. Our trustees were afraid he was going to kill himself, right? And there are letters in our archives worried about what happens if the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous commits suicide as he's writing our next piece of literature. And when I think about it, I relate to that so much, because if you took me out from the place where I was with drunks every day, focusing on them, and you put me in a place where I was isolated and alone, no matter how much intellectual information I had about the process of recovery, self-centeredness would overtake me again. Go back into that place of locked up self-centered fear. And eventually, over a period of time, I would drink again against my own will. But if I'm willing to stay in the middle of this program, as Clancy used to say, if I'm willing to stay in the boat and keep rowing the boat, then I get to have a wonderful, beautiful, safe life at Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not lost on me that I appear before you today sane, sober, and clothed. That's big stuff for me. I was just coming back from my hotel room. I was downtown and had to Uber over to my hotel room to put on a tie and do this talk. And I felt the sun shining on me. The sun is 93 million miles away, and the sun shined on all of us today. There is nothing I can do that is powerful enough to change the fact that the sun shines on me. If I walk outside on a sunny day, the sun can't say, "No sunshine for you, Rory. I know what you've done." The sun shines on me because that is the function of the sun. Similar to God loves me because that is the function of God. There is nothing I can do that is powerful enough to stop God from loving me. There is nothing I can do that is powerful enough to keep God from loving me. But if I hide in my house, if I hide in the basement and I don't get any sunshine, that's not the sun's fault. And a guy like me, against my own will, I will become locked in so much self-centered fear that I'm hiding in the basement. But Alcoholics Anonymous showed me the way out of the basement, and I will forever be grateful for that. In the fifth tradition, it says the primary purpose of any group of Alcoholics Anonymous is to carry the message. And I'm a member of a group of Alcoholics Anonymous, so I believe that the primary purpose in my life is to carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. That comes above anything else in my life. And as a result, I have a wonderful life. I'm sober since June the 5th of 2010. For that, I owe you my life, and I pledge my life to you. Thank you.